Hello, and welcome to another edition of Focus One. The 2013 Florida legislative session is over. A record $74.5 billion budget has been passed. It includes an extra $1 billion for education in Florida. Approximately half of that money is going to go for teachers' salaries. Teachers in Florida are getting a raise. We haven't been able to say that in a number of years. In addition, we've had a number of reform bills that are passed, most notably ethics reform, campaign finance, and elections reform. To top the list of things that didn't get done, Medicaid expansion, which will continue to be controversial over the coming years. In order to help break down the session, I've brought veteran political reporter of Tampa Tribune, Wendy March, back to the show.
Hi,
Wendy.
Frank.
Wendy, let's just start off with the record budget. Break it down for us. What are some of the notable things in there?
Well, the biggest thing, like you mentioned, is the money for about $480 million for raises for teachers. And this was a priority of Governor Rick Scott. He didn't get it quite the way he wanted to get it. What Scott wanted was a $2,500 a year across-the-board raise for every teacher, but the legislature would not go along with that.
Explain something to me just on that across. It just seems a little odd in that if my memory doesn't fail me, I recollect Governor Scott being a pretty strong proponent of, again, a merit-based type systems. And again, so sort of the egalitarian nature of an across-the-board $2,500 raise just seems a little at odds with where he was a couple of years ago.
Exactly, and that's what the legislature didn't like about it. It's also out of character for Scott, and it's one of the aspects of this budget that could generate some problems for Scott in terms of his base, the Tea Party-style conservative Republicans. They don't like it. He did not, in fact, get that egalitarian across-the-board raise. What he got instead, what the legislature gave him, was a raise for teachers that'll be bargained between the teachers union and the school districts and applied according to some of the merit pay standards the legislature's instituted recently. So that's one of the big things. Another thing worth noting is that the budget has got a lot of what are known in Tallahassee as member projects.
Gobble, gobble.
Gobble, gobble. They're also called turkeys. And at the federal level, they're similar to what you call earmarks. Mm-hmm. Question is, how many of these is Scott going to veto? And it's a real straightforward balancing act for Scott. The more he vetoes, the better he looks to his Tea Party base. But the more he angers the
centrists, moderates, yes.
Yeah, the mainstream Republicans that he's going to be depending on in the elections. So what's happened here is that Florida has passed now the largest budget in state history. Mm-hmm. That's not what, this Scott was elected on smaller government, lower taxes.
Yeah, it's not the slogan that you want to rally Tea Party support with.
Largest budget in state history is not what Scott wants to see on his.
But nevertheless, it's not that hard to spin in that if he just argues that it's a reflection of a recovering economy, and that's what I was brought in to do, was to repair their economy. So the reason that we have a bigger budget is because the economy is getting better.
That's exactly what he's arguing. What he's saying is my tax cuts and my spending limits worked, the economy is revived, and now we have the money to invest in things like education. This is what he's been saying since the start of the session, and I think you're going to continue to hear him say that same thing through the 2014 election.
What are some of the other things in the budget you think, either potential turkeys or things that are sticking out that you think he's going to look long and hard at before either passing or vetoing? Well,
one thing he's almost said for sure that he's going to veto is a tuition increase at Florida's public universities. He was opposed to it from the start of the session. Universities wanted it. The legislature went along with it. But Scott is saying publicly that this shouldn't be done and won't fly. He says it's a tax on Florida families.
Certainly he'll probably get pushback from the Board of Governors on the part of the state university system.
Absolutely, but it's one of the things he can veto that probably will be least will cause the least amount of friction with the Republicans in the legislature.
I want to come back a second, circle back to the pay increase issue and the potential for that to cause some friction and consternation, certainly down at the sort of the county level. The amount of money that we're talking about in aggregate, obviously, when you're getting close to $500 million, sounds great, but in reality, on average, for a broad range of teachers and also administrators within, I think, the K through 12 system, it's not a whole lot. And so, to the extent that you're putting in place a merit-based system, there's that age-old problem with sometimes you want your better teachers to be targeting students that need improvement as opposed to just the ones that already do well on, again, standardized tests. So how much friction do you think might be there in terms of unions and, again, local school districts arguing over, again, how to allocate those pay raises? There was an interesting article in today's Sarasota Herald Tribune, too, with respect to teachers' age. They may or may not be included, again, in the pool of folks that get pay raises, and many folks think that they deserve it. But the more people that you include in the pool, the less of a raise you have for everybody that's in it.
Well, Frank, there's already a bunch of tension over this issue. There are already lawsuits over the requirement imposed last year by the legislature for merit pay. Now or for accountability standards and merit pay and setting teacher raises. Now, it's real hard to argue with giving the bigger raises to the people that perform best, but the devil's in the details.
That's right.
And the how these merit standards are to be instituted and what standards are to be used hasn't even been decided yet.
Right.
So these raises are to be allocated according to a merit pay system that isn't even in place yet. And in some cases, it's supposed to be based, at least in part, 50% I think, on students' test scores. But there are some subjects that are taught in the schools where there are no standardized tests.
Right.
So there's nothing to compare the teacher's performance to. Teachers, in addition, say that Florida is already so far down in the state rankings on what it pays teachers. We're in a, thank God for Mississippi situation, very close to 50th in the nation, if not 50th, I don't think, but very close to it, that there's absolutely no reason not to elevate everybody to give an across-the-board raise. So these are the arguments that are going to be made and already are being made over this issue.
Let me switch gears and move over to some of the reform bills that did make it. Our Senate President Gates, his highest priority was, I think, ethics reform.
Right.
Speaker Weatherford, his highest priority was campaign finance reform.
Right.
We got bills through. They both got what they wanted, correct?
Exactly, and that's the way it works in the legislature. When you have the Senate President, very powerful on one side, the House Speaker, very powerful on the other, when they've each got something the other wants, there's a good chance they'll both get it because they trade back and forth. They roll that log.
There seemed to be a lot less tension this year between the Senate President and the House Speaker relative to the last few years.
Well, there was a lot of criticism last year of the performance of the Senate President then, Mike Herodopoulos, and that criticism is one of the things that eventually led to Herodopoulos dropping out of the U.S.
Right,
Senate
he was
race.
in a way, jockeying or positioning himself for the Senate.
Right. In this case, Don Gates, the state Senate President, has few or no political ambitions, it's widely thought, beyond where he is right now, President of the State Senate. There are certain things he wants to accomplish. Nobody thinks he's going to run for higher office later on. If he does, it'll surprise everybody, including me. So he's not trying to set himself up for anything. Will Weatherford, on the other hand, is viewed as a rising star in the Republican Party, and there's already talk about him. He's very young.
In his 30s, right? Mid-30s,
yes.
yeah.
And I can't give you the exact age, but he's very young to be in his position, and there's already talk about him seeking higher office soon.
Let's come back and just maybe if you can give me some of the takeaway points for the reform bills that went through. What's going to be different with respect to ethics in Florida, and what's going to be different with respect to campaign finance?
Well, the ethics bill does a couple of things, its main points. One is it establishes a conflict of interest rule that affects legislators voting on issues that could financially directly impact themselves or their immediate families. The other is it sets some rules on lobbying, on some restrictions on lobbying after the legislator leaves office. It also prohibits the legislator under certain circumstances from taking a high-paid state job while in office. Now, these things are aimed, at least in part, well, they're aimed partly at the revolving door of legislators lobbying, but they're also aimed, at least in part, at fixing the severe stain on the image of Florida politicians that arose from the Ray Sansom case.
Right.
The state house speaker who got involved in allegations that he had funneled money to a small college in North Florida in return for its providing him with a cushy, highly paid job. Campaign finance reform, Will Weatherford got the biggest single thing he wanted, which was an increase in the contributions limits, the amount that people can contribute to political campaigns. Also abolition of a certain kind of independent political committees that don't report the sources of their contributions but can affect elections. There was a lot of argument in favor of those increased contributions limits. Florida's limits were very low, and
there's an important person that might want to keep them low, though.
Well,
however.
Rick Scott said he was opposed to increasing contributions limits. He said he saw no need for them. He is wealthy enough to fund his own campaign. He spent $73 million of his own money to win the governor's office back in last election in 2010. And a lower contribution limit makes it harder
for somebody
to raise enough money to challenge him. But the bill did go through. It's unlikely that Scott will veto that, although he has said repeatedly, I see no need for this.
But it's unlikely that he'll go so far as to... What would you think happen if he did veto it?
Well, that would upset this sort of balanced apple cart between Gates and Weatherford, where each got what they wanted out of the session, scratching each other's back. And I think it's entirely likely that they would get a veto override on that one.
And therefore, the stronger the incentive for Rick Scott to leave well enough alone, not to embarrass himself.
Yes, I believe it passed by a large enough majority to override a veto.
Let me just talk about one other piece of major reform where you can determine, weigh in on whether you think it's major. It's the elections reform. Certainly, the last couple of elections, I mean, our national image is just Florida can't get it right with respect. That's one thing after another. We put through some changes, or at least rolled back things in the direction of how they used to be. Talk about the bill that was passed in terms of elections reform.
Well, if you recall, in November of 2012, there was an embarrassing situation in Florida, nationally embarrassing. People were making the Florida jokes. Jay Leno, the late night comics were having a field day. This is an attempt to solve those problems. And those problems actually resulted, or some of them did at least, from a previous election reform that was passed in 2011.
Right.
This was an attempt to fix that. And what it does is, the previous reform, the 2011 bill, sharply limited early voting. Critics say that those limits were what caused the TV pictures of the hours-long lines, people waiting 6 and 7 hours to vote, mostly in South Florida. This bill does not require the counties to go back to the previous 14 days of early voting, but it allows them to. The 2011 bill had cut it down to 8 days. It does a few other things. Democrats and voting rights advocacy groups had argued strongly for this bill. They're not 100% satisfied with it, but they're close enough so that most of the Democrats in the legislature supported it.
Going back to 2012, some of the sort of the Miami-Dade County officials bear some responsibility for those really long lines with respect to, they did have some discretion in terms of the amount of sort of voting places that they were able to set. How much of it was the constraints that were imposed on them by the law, and how much was maybe some mistakes in terms of their planning?
Well, that's the argument, and the responsibility of the local supervisors is the argument that conservatives and Republicans were making. Statewide, the Democrats and voting rights advocates said that there was far too strict a limit on the number of early voting locations allowed. Critics pointed out that in the 2012 election, there were far fewer early voting stations open than were allowed. In other words, the election supervisors didn't even use all of the sites that they would have been allowed to use. Election supervisors responded, well, a lot of those sites aren't suitable. You couldn't put a poll there. Miami-Dade, where the worst problems occurred, where you saw the longest lines, the election supervisor there is the only one in the state who is appointed rather than elected. There's been a lot of criticism that failure to provide adequate early voting opportunities was his fault rather than the fault of the law. Statewide, however, Republicans and conservatives agreed to go back to allowing the full 14 days instead of the 8. In the 2010 election, it was 14 days. In 2012, it was cut down to 8, and now it will go back to optional 14.
To 14. And one of the issues, my understanding too, was that there was a big push to use the absentee ballots, which were allowed. You could turn them in right up on to election day, and so there were some issues in terms of an influx coming at the 11th hour in terms of getting those counted as well. One of the, I think, the sort of the interesting dimensions of elections reform politics, a component of the proposed legislation that didn't get approved, that was pulled out, had to do with the assistance that could be provided to by poll workers to some of the folks that were voting. Can you talk a little bit about that little dynamic?
This is one of the reasons that Democrats went along with the bill, even though they had some objections to it. Initially, it contained a provision limiting the activities of poll helpers. These are people who go to the polls, volunteers. They usually work for voting rights advocacy groups or politically active organizations, liberal or progressive mostly. For example, the Service Employees International Union, a large politically active union. And they go to the polls and they help voters there, usually language minorities, Spanish speakers, Haitian Creole speakers in Southeast Florida, people who may not know English and may not even be literate in their own language, and they help these people vote. Now, some of these poll helpers will stay at the polls all day, and they'll work with 70, 80 or more voters. The bill would have limited them to helping only people they were already acquainted with before Election Day, and to helping no more than 10 in a day.
Why would you do that, other than trying to, again, perhaps indirectly suppress some of the voting?
Suppressing, the idea that this is voter suppression is the argument that the Democrats and voting rights advocates made. Conservatives argued that some of these people, rather than just helping voters, were trying to influence their votes. So this is the argument back and forth. That provision was taken out of the bill by State Senator Jack Latvala, Pinellas County, a very influential legislator from Pinellas County, and that swung a lot of Democrats in favor of it. Another thing that swung Democrats in favor of it was that a couple of Democratic legislators from St. Petersburg, Dwight Dudley and Darrell Roussan, got together with Deborah Clark, who's the elections supervisor in Pinellas. She was criticized for limited early voting opportunities in Pinellas in 2012, and they say that she has agreed to keep an open mind, be flexible on the number of early voting days and the number of early voting sites.
In the next election. While we're on things that didn't materialize in terms of legislation, probably the biggest piece of work that did not get done, for better or worse, was Medicaid expansion. That's certainly something Democrats wanted to see happen. It was something our Senate president ultimately was able to foster through a bill. House, nothing got done, though. The governor actually supported it in theory, but he didn't push too hard for it. So the legislative session has ended. Florida will not expand Medicaid, which will render it ineligible for a lot of funding on the part of the overhaul in the Obamacare system, affordable health care system. Talk to me about what are the implications, first, of us not passing legislation, and then maybe come back into the politics. Is this going to be the final word, or are we going to revisit this again, either in a special session or the next legislative session?
Well, it could be a significant problem, and a lot of healthcare advocates say it will be. The reason is that the Affordable Care Act, the healthcare reform known as Obamacare, assumes that states would accept this expansion of Medicaid, and therefore it cuts down on the money that's given to hospitals who treat indigent people who can't afford to pay. It cuts down on that money, assuming that those people will be able to afford to pay with Medicaid. Florida now will get the cuts, but not the expanded Medicaid. This is going to be a major problem, according to advocates. Now, Rick Scott, this is another issue, like the teacher raises, where Rick Scott took a stance that was very uncharacteristic according to his public image.
Sure.
He was strongly in favor of accepting this expanded Medicaid program and the expanded federal money that went with it.
At the end of the session, though, it might not have been strongly in favor, just sort of in favor.
Well, he spoke publicly. He spoke out publicly on it before the session started. Democrats say that he didn't work strongly enough, that he didn't do the arm twisting, that he didn't work the legislature, that he didn't really take a strong stand.
I think for most observers, it's hard to make the case that he didn't. At a certain point, when it became clear that maybe it wasn't clear, but it didn't look like it was going to get done, he sort of refrained from investing any more political capital in the issue than he already had prior to the session starting. Is that a pretty accurate characterization?
That is accurate so far, but it's not over yet.
Okay.
Democrats, including Senator Bill Nelson and Kathy Castor, the Tampa Congresswoman, are calling for a special session and to revisit the issue, which passed, a version of the expansion did pass in the Senate under Don Gates. But Will Weatherford, the House Speaker, was dead set against it, and no expansion passed in the House, or no federal expansion. The House was willing to look at a smaller state-funded Medicaid expansion, but not the large one. Critics say that Florida is throwing away $51 billion in federal money, which is the amount that the federal government would have added to the Florida Medicaid program over the next 10 years. They say that losing that money will cost jobs, that it will, that the denial of access to health care to people who would otherwise get it will hurt the state's economy. Scott made that argument. Scott said, I can't in good conscience deny our people that benefit. And he did this even though he started his political career as an opponent of Obamacare, of the Affordable Care Act.
Over time, do you think this will continue do you think it will be a political liability for the governor, Republicans in general, or do you think it's just going to be a fait accompli that, again, we're just one of the states that doesn't go along with the Affordable Health Care Act?
Well, there are other states that are not going along with it. Florida is the largest one so far that has actually taken action to reject it, but Texas, which is next largest state up, could reject it. It's still open there, but it looks like Texas is leaning toward rejecting it. Other states, mostly red states, Tennessee, for example, have also rejected the Medicaid expansion. The issue may not be over. As I said, Democrats are pressing for a special session. They'll bring it back up, and they will certainly use it as a campaign point against Republicans if they can.
Stay tuned. The health care politics will continue to be a pretty prominent issue for,
sure will.
For a number of electoral seasons to come. We're winding down. We got about 5 minutes left. Let me just pull back the lens and maybe just political handicap the outcomes. How well do you think this session went for, certainly for Rick Scott, as he's now positioning himself for his re-election campaign in 2014, and then just maybe some of the other big winners or losers that you see coming out of this session?
Well, one winner is the teachers. They're going to get at least some kind of a raise. Rick Scott got enough to claim victory, but he didn't get everything he wanted. He got a raise for teachers, didn't get it the way he wanted it. He got his other announced biggest priority, which was eliminating the sales tax on manufacturing equipment. He says that will spur manufacturing jobs. The problem there is
There's a little bit of a potential constitutional issue.
Yeah, there's a problem there. Many people say that that required a 2/3 vote in order to pass. It passed, but it did not get a 2/3 vote. It's possible that there will be litigation.
And the trigger for that is it's a word that lends itself to broad interpretation, right? It's whether or not this is a significant component of the revenue of local governments.
Exactly. Whether it has a significant effect. I can't cite you the exact wording, but it's whether it has a significant effect on the budgets of local governments, who, of course, get the proceeds from the sales tax.
And it's a small portion of their overall budgets, but the overall number is somewhat big. All depends upon how you look at it. So,
sure.
Do you think local governments will challenge this? Do you think there's going to be pressure to actually challenge it legally?
It's hard to imagine somebody somewhere won't, particularly with local governments feeling the financial pressure that they're feeling. But we'll see.
Other winners or losers?
Well, Will Weatherford, as I said, thought of as a rising star in the Republican Party. He came through the session, got a couple of his biggest priorities accomplished. The campaign finance reform was one, halting Medicaid expansion was another, but he took some public relations hits along the way. His opening speech, the opening speech on the first day of the session, was when he drew his line in the sand against Medicaid expansion. And amazingly, he chose to argue for it by citing the case of his own brother, who had benefited from a Medicaid program as a child. And he argued that my brother got the safety net treatment, we don't need this Medicaid expansion. Well, it turned out that the safety net that helped his brother was funded by the Medicaid program. He took a hit on that. There had also been an expectation prior to this session that you'd see more of a kinder, gentler Republican legislature and a little more bipartisan cooperation. Well, that went down the tubes. It wasn't as bad as some recent sessions have been, but there was still a lot of bipartisan bitterness, most of it over that Medicaid issue.
Yeah. There were a lot of happy pictures I thought I saw at on the last day there. But,
right.
We're pretty much out of time. Certainly we could probably do another half hour. But in terms of things we might have missed, other pieces of legislation you just want to make a quick point on before we wrap it up?
Well, there are dozens of those. One that I'll bring up because the Tribune's done a story on it is a piece of legislation that affected how appeals of red light camera tickets are handled. This could sharply increase the cost if you get a red light ticket and decide you don't deserve it and try to appeal it.
Sort of like going to the casino and daring me to double down in terms
exactly.
on Wendy, I think that was terrific. Thanks for stopping by. We'll definitely be bringing you back again.
Glad to do it, Frank.
Thanks. We'll see you all in the next edition of Focus One.